This is the landing page for Financial Edge NXT. At the very top, you can see the Omnibar, and this is how we'll be navigating within the expense management module. But before we get there, we're going to start out in the Treasury. Now, keep in mind when it comes to setting up user credentials, you can specify and lock down access. So, for example, if it's just somebody who is going to be submitting expenses, the only thing they would have access to is the expense management module. The rest of the Omnibar would be black, so they wouldn't be able to access any other modules that they should not be in. So let's look briefly at the Treasury. We're going to go into credit card accounts. This is where you can actually directly link your credit card accounts into Financial Edge NXT. So all of those transactions will flow in for you automatically. So if I wanted to connect more feeds, for example, and we'll help you through this process when we go through implementation, I can search for that credit card merchant. If it's one of these already here at the top, you could simply select those. You would put in your credentials, connect, and then all of your feeds will be coming into the solution automatically. So for example, in the lower left-hand corner, we can simulate that your credit card merchant is a MasterCard. So we would go in here and be able to set up all the things around that credit card, including any limits, GL accounts. We can have specific credit cards set up tied to that. So for example, in my previous role, when I used Financial Edge NXT, we had a Visa card and we had 20 cards within that account. I can also come in and view my credit card transactions as they are flowing into Financial Edge NXT. So I can see all of my active cards that I have. I can drill into any card and see my balances. And then I can track my credit card feed history. Now, within each one of these cards, I can assign them specifically to stakeholders in my organization. Financial Edge will then link those credit cards to those user credentials so that when they access the expense management module, just their credit card feed and their transactions will populate in the expense management module. Before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about configuration for approval rules and expense categories. So we're going to navigate to settings. And notice in the upper left-hand corner, we can set up approval rules. So we have an add icon here in the upper left-hand corner. This is going to allow me to establish a rule name, give that a description, and then I can establish an approval flow. So for example, I can have a single level of approval, or I can have multiple levels based on spending authority. Once I've got that set up, those approval rules will show in my approval library and my list here. So notice I've got multiple approval rules here. I can name them, and this approval rule, for example, is called office supplies. And there's two approvers, and you can see their spending authority limits. As I scroll on down, you can see that we have multiple levels here. We've got 3 levels for the admin approval rule. One thing to note here is that you can also set approval rules up with no dollar limits. You just have multiple sets of eyes that need to see this. Now, in my previous role, I set it up to where I was always the final approver. Once it flowed into the business office, I would make sure that it was booked out properly. I would sanitize it before it went into the actual check run. Notice too, I can have a single level of approval, just one approval name, one approval level dollar amount, and one individual. So I can have a very large spending approval authority if I wish. And we'll show you how that comes into play when we are actually entering submissions. The next thing is expense categories. And I can add any number of expense categories with my add button. And this allows me to name that category, give it a description. I can set up how it's going to be calculated. And then I can set up specific GL account codes that will tie automatically to that expense category. And again, this will make more sense when we enter some submissions. So that's essentially the configuration piece. When we go through implementation with you with Financial Edge NXT, this becomes very clear and we will help you through that process. Next, we're going to talk about the process of entering submissions. So let's go into Manage Expenses. And this could be any stakeholder in your organization. So for example, Let's just say that Jane Doe has been assigned a credit card for your organization. So when she logs in, only her credit card transactions are going to show in this tile in the upper left-hand corner. Jane Doe would navigate to My Credit Card Transactions and select Work with My Charges. Once this screen renders, notice on the left-hand column, this represents a comprehensive feed of all of Jane Doe's transactions coming into the organization. So if she selects a transaction on the left, Financial Edge will pull that over onto the right-hand side for Jane Doe to record the transaction. So she would simply select a vendor. By typing this in, it will automatically pull and look at vendors listed in the AP vendor list. Jane Doe would put a description of the event or the expense. And then notice Jane Doe has to select that approval rule. Now you can open this up to your staff to allow them to select between any approval rules within the organization, or you can lock it down to each individual has an assigned approval rule by default. As she scrolls on down, she's going to be required to put in expense detail and purpose. And this is where the expense categories come into play when we're talking about the distribution and how to book this expense out. So for example, Jane Doe might come in here and look for a miscellaneous expense. Once that comes in, we're going to be able to look at the distribution. Financial Edge allows for smart search and auto entry. So if we start typing that expense category for that GL, we can bring that in and select it. Now you have an option here. For my staff, I didn't make it a requirement that they book it out. They could just enter the expense, attach the documentation, and we filled in all the GL information once it came into the business office. So this is how it would be filled out as far as the GL distribution. There could be any number of expense categories, for example, if they were split. Notice also that we have an opportunity for your staff to attach their documentation. So this could be from a cell phone. They could scan it into a server location, go out to a desktop or that server, drag and drop it in. They've also got the capability on the lower right-hand side to link it to Google Docs, Dropbox, SharePoint, wherever that might be stored. Down in the lower left-hand corner, notice that Jane Doe can submit this transaction for approval. Once Jane Doe submits this, the system will automatically send an email to the approval rule that was set up and that she selected for this process. In addition to credit card transactions, you are able to submit expense reports. Notice on the right-hand side, the tile is titled My Invoice Request. So this is multi-purpose. During implementation, if you wish, we can relabel this to My Reimbursement Requests. But let's just say that John Doe has traveled for your organization. He is able to come in then and create a new expense report with the Add button in the upper left-hand corner. Once this renders, John Doe would select himself as the vendor. If it's appropriate, if there's an invoice number or date, we'll talk about that in a moment for invoice request. John Doe would put a description of his expense. Let's just say that John Doe traveled for your organization. Notice John Doe also has to select an approval rule. Again, it can be a default for his supervisor or department, or he's allowed to select from any number of approval rules as appropriate. John Doe would enter the expense detail and purpose. And again, John Doe has to select the expense category. So for any travel, there's going to be multiple expense categories. So for every receipt he has from his travel, he can select the appropriate expense category. And we're not going to take the time to build out an actual expense report, but you can get the idea pretty quickly. It's pretty extensive. So any expense categories that you have that would be made available are going to be listed. Once John Doe enters the amount of that expense, he's going to have the option to go ahead and book that expense out. And you can set this up where the GL accounts will default fill if you fill that information out when you set up the expense category. And again, down at the bottom, John Doe can attach copies of all of his receipts for review by the approver that he's requested to review his expense report. Again, in the lower left-hand corner, John Doe would submit this expense report. An email will be sent automatically to that approval rule, be it a supervisor, be it a department, cost center, whatever it would be. They'll get that email notifying them that they have an expense report to review. Now, the third option is the capability to have your staff enter invoices. So it's in the same area that John Doe entered his expense report. So this is an opportunity to enter an actual invoice for payment. Now, this can be pre or post. We'll talk about both. So let's just say that we've already spent the money and we want to put this into the workflow for payment. We could search for that vendor. We would put that appropriate invoice number in, date, a description, select that approval rule, purpose of that invoice, and then select the expense category for that invoice, for whatever that might be. And the process looks very similar to the John Doe expense report. So we would select that expense category, we would put in the amount, and then we would go ahead and book that out. And then we could attach a copy of the invoice and submit that for approval. So now that we've got all of our submissions in place, we are ready to look at that approval workflow. So for all of those supervisors or department heads or cost centers, you could come into the same area within expense management and manage expenses. Notice in the lower left-hand corner, there's a tile titled My Approvals. So any pending approvals would be listed here and you would simply select them. You would search for that pending approval on the left-hand side. When you select that pending approval, it will populate in the panel on the right-hand side. All the content that was entered by the submitter will be listed here for review. So everything that was put in that request, including any attachments, and if it was also entered in terms of GL distribution, you would be able to review that as well. Now the approver has three options. If you'll notice down at the bottom, they can approve, reject, or save. If they approve, it automatically goes to that next level approval. If this is the final approval level, it will flow into the business office for inclusion in the next check run. Now, if that approver decides to reject this, they can select reject, the modal populates, you can select the reason for the rejection. You can also select notes to fill in specifics. Maybe that submitter didn't include their documentation, and save this. Once it's saved, the system will automatically send an email back to the submitter so that they can fix the problem, resubmit it through the workflow. The approver opens it up again and this time approves it. They can also save it for review later. Again, once the approval process is complete, everything will flow into the AP module so it could be reviewed, processed, paid, and so forth. So let's take a quick look at the AP module. So we're going to navigate in the Omnibar, and we're going to go to our invoice area. This is going to show us all the invoices that we have in our system. And notice there's a very large list of 5,328. But we can quickly go in and filter and segment this list down. So we're looking at invoices specifically. And we only want to look at pending invoices. And we only want to look at invoices from a date of this month or last month, whatever that time period is. Once we apply the filters, notice in the background, we have over 5,000, but with these filters, we're quickly going to get down to 8 records that we need to approve. Now, from a big picture perspective, I can come over here to the left-hand side and I can select all. And this allows me to approve a bulk list of invoices. I've also got the capability to go into a specific invoice. I can view all of the specific details of that invoice. Notice in my payments tile in the upper left-hand corner, I can see all the information that was entered. Also, on the right-hand side, I have an attachments tile. If I wish, I can actually go in, look at that invoice that's been scanned in and attached, or whatever that documentation looks like. And then notice at the top, I have the option to go ahead and approve that invoice right here. Now within Financial Edge NXT, we also have dashboards available. This would allow you to actually build a dashboard to be able to easily monitor all of your invoice activity. So this would be under the accounts payable dashboard. And I can set up specific filters around my invoice date, my post status, payment status. I can select by vendors, by fund, by project description, and invoice payment method. Then I would be able to come in here specifically and look at all of my invoices, open them up, approve them, and so forth. Whatever that workflow looks like for you, whatever process works best for you, Financial Edge can support that.